Good morning, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine war. It is a little unusual that we're bringing you a couple episodes back-to-back here, but I say we, it was really I sort of went off on a little bit of a rant in terms of aviation safety based on the downing of the MQ-9 Reaper drone a couple days ago by Russian jets. And yeah, so if aviation safety is not your thing, apologize for that. But we are going to focus on this episode on what we intended to provide some more in-depth thoughts on last time, which is the fighting going on around Bakhmut. But before we do get to that, there are a couple of very sort of small updates and news items that have happened in the last 48 hours that we do want to get to. So, as always, we are joined here by Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia SME, and welcome back, Yuval. And before I forget, because I do forget these things, happy birthday, and hope you have a great day. Enjoy time with your family. Definitely deserve some time off and some relaxation. Many happy returns. All right, so with that, let's get into quick updates from the last 48 hours, and then we'll go into what we wanted to about Bakhmut last time.
So certainly, and I think for all the viewers and the listeners, who amongst us is not inflamed and impassioned by aviation safety? In essence, just to put not to put the pin on it, because this will be a story that I think will lead to changes in force posture on both sides. But one of the things that we described on, I guess, 2 days ago, in terms of the time that we were recording, is that you had predicted that basically U.S. Air Force, UCOM, would be releasing all the various radar tracking, the video, etc., probably showing the Russians not only engaging in unsafe, but incompetent, unprofessional behavior, as I think that was the language from the Air Force a couple days ago. And lo and behold, all such videos that were exactly what we anticipated were released. And basically on the Russian side, I had predicted that the Russian ambassador and Ministry of Defense would say something to the effect of, it's international airspace is ours for purposes of our determination of what we can and you can't do. I think maybe an hour or so after we recorded, the Russian ambassador was interviewed leaving the State Department, where he was called to the carpet in order to be told exactly what they should not be doing. And his comments were to the effect of, this is really dangerous for U.S.-Russia relations, but I'm glad that we're talking about the safety. And of course, it was our airspace in any case. So in terms of saying, this is our airspace, but since we're talking, isn't that really good? Because shouldn't great powers be the ones who really discuss things amongst themselves and then just enforce it with their clients and their proxies? So we have that. We do have, in terms of what are the after effects of this, is just earlier today, the Polish Ministry of Defense announced that it was going to provide its Soviet-era MiG fighter jets to the Ukrainians. And so in that regard, we're starting to see, again, the Western military support to Ukraine started with helmets from the Germans. And as we talked, I think maybe 2 weeks ago or so, when will fighter jets enter the chat? Here we are. So the polls said that there would be 4 or 5 within a very short period of time, like a week, and that they would be basically collecting more over the next few weeks and months. So at this point, I think, again, resident aviation safety expert, but also general lover of all things aviation, what do MiG fighter jets do for the Ukrainians?
So I'll admit, I should probably at this point in the war be able to differentiate between the various different type model series of a former Soviet Union bloc fighter aircraft. I cannot do that, but in a general sense, I think kind of as with the UK Challenger tank numbers that were initially announced, 4 MiGs in a week, that is not going to change the trajectory of the war. That's not even what we would call like a squadron minus in the Marine Corps. That's like a detachment. But if more coming in following weeks, again, there's no single silver bullet weapon system here, but it allows you to do one. It lets you do more things on the battlefield. So fighters have a longer reach to do certain things than certain ground-based firing systems, right? So you can strike deeper, farther in the rear if that's how you want to employ it. I think another key point is in recent weeks, especially with the last couple of Russian long-range missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, it's been noted that some of the hypersonic missiles, the Kinzhal, I believe, Ukrainians say their ground-based air defenses cannot intercept it, which is part of why they were asking for more fighters, because that's a platform that potentially lets them intercept those missiles. So again, it's not going to be a necessarily huge game changer, but now they potentially have 4 more things that they can put up in the air to go after those more capable weapon systems that the ground-based air defenses they don't have right now go after. And then I think we talked about this in a past episode in terms of air defense stuff as well. If you get that option to go after those certain types of incoming missiles, you can do other things with your ground-based air defense systems, move them around, right? Protect different parts of your civilian populations, or maybe they get freed up to go somewhere else on the battlefield to support, say, a counteroffensive. So, again, we're not likely going to see massive air-to-air battles between Ukrainian and Russian MiGs here in the near future, or even in the intermediate future, because I think the state of ground-based air defense on the battlefield is such that neither side is going to be like, we're not going to have a massive air furball free-for-all. But it just increases the options that the Ukrainian military has, both for what it does in the air as well as what those ground-based systems do. They can now go do other things.
No, so certainly, and I think the points to repeat as we've done before. There have been a lot of changes over the course of the war. There's been no, as you put it, there's no like wonder weapon. There's no sort of silver bullet here. There have been a lot of things that have changed basically the parameters of how the war is prosecuted, and these include things such as Starlink to basically provide internet all the way up to the front. These include the Stingers and Javelins in terms of what are basically, what does MANPADS stand for? I always forget.
And portable air defense
And
systems.
system, yeah. And also then the HIMARS came up, and obviously like we had over the last couple of weeks discussions about tanks, and perhaps over the next couple of months we'll see that if the Poles are able to give 4 or 5 jets as they said. I just looked up a quote from their president who said it would not be as many as 14, but that he also expects Slovakia to give a number of its jets as well. So this very well could be something that we described, roughly speaking, about a year ago, which is this is going to be the great renewal of basically Central European, basically air forces. And that over time, it may not be that Ukraine gets all the fighter jets that it wants at once, but over time, basically the supply of fighter jets to it from these countries as they start to basically transition over to F-16s or whatever other US-made fighter jet or whatever sort of like, Rafale, like French one or whatever, we may see that this just becomes part of a new normal for what Ukraine is able to do. And that is basically consistent with your observation that the parameters of what they can do and basically the options that they have available to them, those change and increase over time in order to basically bring this to, hopefully like some sort of conclusion that is positive for Ukraine. And we then essentially, at this point, we can finally start to discuss what is the point of Bakhmut. Because in essence, we can see that this is how do I even put it? It's a battle of attrition in which there probably have been already tens of thousands of dead on both sides, or killed in action on both sides, in order to take what is now effectively a gigantic piece of rubble. So we understand, obviously, fighter jets are coming in. We'll continue to monitor that over time. But we've been discussing Bakhmut and the fight for Bakhmut for a couple weeks now. And so what can we say about it? What sort of, like when we were discussing earlier, what are your initial thoughts, like as a military professional, when you see two sides just slugging it out over a town that prior to the fighting about it did not seem to have much strategic value, but becomes imbued with greater military value over time? So how does that work?
Sure. So I think I have a bunch of notes here that we have, sort of been refining when we said we were going to focus on this. So I'm going to, the order I go through, not necessarily in order of importance, except for the very last one, which I'll get to. But so I think, Bakhmut has gotten a lot more attention in recent weeks, partly because of our, friends over there at the Wagner Group, right? They have been, as we talked about in previous episodes, they've basically been the meat waves thrown in there to wear down Ukrainian defenses. And, that's literally like, pick your movie title, right? Suicide Squad, The Expendables. These are convicts, right? You don't care if they survive. But they're motivated enough by the fact that they're not in jail, and they can have their freedom if they survive the meat waves, right? So, not the best fighters, but potentially motivated. But you fling them in mass to wear stuff down. I think the larger picture that's been painted in the last several weeks, it's not at all a clear one. And depending on sort of the feedback you've seen, like there have been, especially in the last week, in a number of English language news outlets, not a very grim picture painted by the Ukrainians who they've talked to, who've been defending that town. There have been complaints about ammunition shortages, and I would note that ammunition shortages or ammunition rationing has been a problem for both sides, because they have expended far more than the existing production lines are able to replace. And we know our, again, friend of the pod, Prigozhin, right? He's talked about lack of ammunition support from the Ministry of Defense for his Wagner fighters. So, he's probably complaining up to a point to get more, but it's probably also a valid problem that the Russian production line just can't keep up with the ammunition expenditures. Looking at sort of the map laydowns as well, also in recent weeks.
If I could just interrupt for one
Yeah, go ahead.
moment, I think this is a good point, that what's a big lesson from this war? This is, in essence, the number of wars that we've seen over the past, let's say, 50 odd years. We have not seen two evenly matched, more or less contemporary armies fighting against each other like this in quite a while. So this is something that we should note for the future, not like in this particular episode, but what are the munitions requirements for a war like this into the future? What are the defense industrial base requirements for a war like this into the future? Certainly, in a sense, the Ukrainians knew what sort of war was coming, but just didn't simply have enough stuff. The Russians may not have known what kind of war this would be, and so they also did not have enough stuff relative to their expectations. So it's just something that when we think about here in the U.S., what can we take from it? The amount of munitions that you need in order to fight a relatively evenly matched adversary is insane.
Yeah, it is. It is not your peacetime production capacity. And I'm thinking back to wars over the last few decades where they've still been highly destructive, but there were sort of external things that stopped them relatively quickly. So like the Yom Kippur War, 1973, is one that I've studied separately as sort of because that was a wake up call to the destructiveness of modern warfare for U.S. at the time, coming out of Vietnam, looking against fighting irregular forces to fighting essentially pure competitor. That was a laboratory for it. That was massively destructive in the course of 3 weeks, but it was negotiated to an end after 3 weeks before the ammunition shortfalls really would have been a factor after those expenditures. And then you look at Desert Storm, right? The ground war itself was only 100 hours plus or minus. Air campaign was longer, but we also spent months building up stockpiles in Saudi Arabia. Also uninterrupted building those stockpiles. Saddam Hussein did like nothing to interfere with our ability to do that, but it still took months to build up the forces to get there. But then the actual execution, again, it was short enough you weren't running into production challenges after you'd shot everything. Yeah, this is a lesson that should be a wake up call to everybody sort of who's in the arms manufacturing business, and certainly as we look to other possible flashpoints around the world. Peacetime production is not going to cut it. And the time to fix that was probably about 10 years ago, unfortunately.
We'll carry on, but just in terms of thinking, what is wartime production? Maybe wartime is the new peacetime.
Yeah, and it's there's enough that goes on in the defense industrial base that, I mean, we've had a year to sort of prove it, right? Like, doesn't turn on a dime. Those decisions have long lead times for them to have an impact for ramping it up. So yeah, that's a big lesson coming out of this. Okay, where was it? So we were talking about sort of the map situation around Bakhmut, and we've seen in some of the folks like the Institute for the Study of War, parts of Bakhmut have been apparently like confirmed taken. I think the parts of the center city, Wagner Group is there. They've been geolocated, and then there's sort of around the flanks of the city there are these sort of small arms that have been inching their way out to the west. Every time those little arms get farther, it puts more of those fragile supply lines going into the city under. It's not direct military control, but it's I hope I get the phrase right here, but it's fire control basically. So Russian forces are not like physically sitting; their soldiers are not sitting on the supply lines, but their lines are close enough they can, put artillery, rocket fire, that kind of stuff on those supply lines, making resupply much harder. And then I've seen some videos too of I think the main sort of hard paved road going in there is no longer usable for supply. So they're going over these like dirt, basically mud tracks to do the resupplying. So that's a really bad, that's a very hard situation. Now, with that, the Institute Study of War and some of the other external analysts looking in seem to assess that even though those arms around the flanks they're inching their way forward, that the sort of the Russian or Wagner group force behind it, like they basically culminated, which is sort of a military term for you've expended all of your energy and like you have nothing left to go forward. So you would have to pause or halt to sort of reconstitute. We don't have enough, I think, information to know one way or the other. And obviously the, Russian Ministry of Defense and Wagner Group are not going to tell us, yes, we've culminated, we're done, right? But you can, sort of by watching progress over the ground, it has been very hard for them to extend those arms on the flanks. If they can't close those arms together, it still puts Bakhmut in a very hard position, but it's not a complete encirclement. And it would sort of just, at that point, you're trying to use your fire control to influence supplies going in, but you haven't encircled the city. I guess I'll switch over to sort of my thoughts on what this fighting there means. It was interesting because a couple of weeks ago when we first started looking at it, on the U.S. side, there have been fairly public statements from some parts of the Defense Department and other op-ed writers and analysts, right, that Bakhmut, its military value was never very high. That if initially the defense of it, there was a very favorable exchange ratio to casualties, like 5-1 or 7-1 against the Russians, which, if you can keep up that exchange rate, that's great, right? Because Ukraine doesn't have the same manpower depth. So if you're getting 7 Russians for every one Ukrainian casualty, that's something you'd probably want to sustain as long as that ratio stays that way, because you are cutting into that manpower advantage that Russia can bring to bear. Now, there's been some question lately about whether that ratio is still that high or has come down to something more equaling parity, which means holding that place no longer gives you the military value that you were getting from it. Even though the city itself might not be strategic, the casualty exchange was. But if it's not, you should not continue to do that, because you will lose that manpower exchange overall. And then they have also noted that even if the Russians, if they take Bakhmut completely, those forces have been so exhausted that they have no way to exploit it, right? Like talking about the culminating of the campaign, even if they close those arms, those forces, Wagner, regular Russian forces, will they will have culminated, because they have poured so much energy and resources just to completing that encirclement. They'll have nothing left to punch through to gain any further advantage. And then with that, it's also been noted that the terrain that's all to the west of Bakhmut is actually equal, if not better than, for defense. It's higher terrain. It's got known avenues of approach. And if you establish a new line there, you would have this exhausted Russian force. Great, they got the city. Now there's an even tougher nut to crack. Which I can't read minds. I can't say if on the U.S. or European side they've been trying to drop strong hints that the Ukrainians should do that. But the message has been, even if Bakhmut was taken, it gains Russia almost nothing, and they will have expended a massive amount of their resources to go take it. With that, though, at about the same time these things were coming up from the Western side, President Zelensky and other Ukrainian military leaders said we're not withdrawing, and in fact, they're saying they were going to send more forces to hold it. And so this gets into why Bakhmut, why this massive, if that military logic is no longer favorable, why stay there? And so this gets into my thoughts here in no random order, no particular order, except for the very last one, which I think is sort of the key one. So one, I think, is nobody really has a great view of what's going on around there. So we don't really know if the situation is as good or as bad as, this sort of anecdotal reporting is coming out. And it's been interesting to me that there have been some pretty free comments by Ukrainian soldiers interviewed by some of the news outlets about like things are bad there, right? What's interesting about that is, one, they were allowed to make those comments, right, in a public forum. Two, they are to English language news outlets. So it is possible that allowing that as part of a larger strategic messaging campaign back to Western countries, being like, hey, it's really bad there. If we had more ammunition, it wouldn't be so bad. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, give us more ammunition kind of
Right,
thing.
right.
Right. Two, that feeds into other aspects of strategic messaging, which is that it's the refrain of Bakhmut, Bakhmut, Bakhmut has focused everybody's attention there, right? Everybody. They're all looking in one place. Where are we not looking now? So it's sort of, again, I'm not a mind reader. I can't say that this is, there's how deliberate it is or how coincidental, but we recall that when we were focusing on Kherson, right, the sort of the public message was, we're going back to Kherson, we're going back to Kherson, we're going back to Kherson. And then they went to Kharkiv, right? They threw the
Right.
punch up there where lines were weaker and where Kharkiv region had not been in the discussion. The focus was on Kherson. It is possible that there is another element of both messaging and deception operations at work to keep attention focused on Bakhmut by all parties, so that other parts of the line get less attention, and in preparation for a counteroffensive that everybody knows is coming, right? But we don't know the when or the where. But the longer you keep attention where it's not coming, gains you potential advantage where it is coming. And you may want to reinforce that.
Putting those together is the first point is, if the Russians take Bakhmut, Kramatorsk is obviously to the west. Kramatorsk is higher. The Ukrainians have been preparing for the defense of that. So ultimately, the value of Bakhmut sort of grows bigger than the actual military strategic value. And certainly, just one of the things I wanted to mention is that the estimates of Russian casualties in the taking of Bakhmut, which is obviously still ongoing, has been as high as 20 to 30,000. So that's a lot. That's a lot of people in any which way, shape, or form. And all at the same time that, the Ukrainian side have been talking about the counteroffensive that's coming. We still haven't seen the Western battle tanks being put into service just yet. And so if the Ukrainians do lose Bakhmut, and this is something that we can talk maybe about the psychological value and trajectories of the war, it could very well be that they're tiring out Russian forces in order to make the counteroffensive that much more devastating or lethal for the Russian side when it does come. Sorry, carry on.
Yes, and that ties into sort of the third thing maybe it's a 2.5 or a third, but I was going to mention is if you're trying to set conditions for that counteroffensive or for what you believe is going to be a vital military move, you want to do everything possible in all dimensions to make sure that offensive is successful, especially if you think it might be your only shot this year, right? When that punch lands, you want it to be the hardest, the most well supported, and the most effective for as long as that punch is able to drive forward, because you don't necessarily know if you're going to get another one. This gets into sort of, as you were saying, like maybe Bakhmut didn't have a specific strategic military value before, but for what it's become, it may have that for a couple reasons. One, the casualty exchange rate, but also to help set conditions for the counteroffensive wherever it does actually land. And this gets into it's, I don't want to call it cynical, but it is kind of it's a cold, bloody military logic that sometimes you may have to require your troops to endure horrible things, and to potentially take really bad casualties, because there is literally a greater good that they are supporting by what they are doing there. And the example I was going to throw out there, and I want to be clear, like I think the example I'm about to cite, I'm going to talk about the Trojan Reservoir a little bit, and this is partly to sort of it's a more familiar campaign to Marine Corps audience, but I'm not equating sort of the suffering, because that was a campaign of a few weeks. Like, this has been going on for months and months. So I'm not saying the level of suffering is the same, but the point is, you sometimes ask certain units to suffer and endure in really, really bad conditions, because if they don't, something else even worse potentially happens, and they are the ones holding the door open. And the example I'm throwing out there is the stand. It's called The Last Stand, the Fox Company. There's a book called that title. The point is, during the Trojan campaign, when you had a Marine and Army task force going up into what is now North Korea, trying to chase what was left of the North Korean army, basically to China during the Korean War. They were eventually counterattacked by massive Chinese infantry forces, vastly outnumbered. And so they were trapped around this man-made reservoir up in northern part of Korea. Horrible. This was at winter, and winter is very, very bad in Korea. Like, we say freezing temperatures. It was, like, it's so cold the blood congealed like seconds after touching the air, right? Like, it was bad. As the Chinese forces came forward, they were very close to encircling and destroying the Marine forces that were there. And so there was one point where the one road that part of the Marine Force had to retreat back to the main road junction and supply base that would allow them to egress further to the south and preserve their force. There was one road going through a pass called Talktong Pass that was the only road the Marine forces forward of that mountain ridge could get back to evacuate. And their Fox company from 7th Marine Regiment was put up there and said, "You will hold that pass. You will like stand and die, basically. Like, you will hold that road open because you don't have a choice, right? If you do not hold that road open, thousands of Marines that are on the other side of it die." And so they went up there. Over the course of a few days, they were outnumbered about 20-1. They took 50% casualty rate. They had very low on ammunition, very low on food. Everybody's got dysentery. They're all pooping in their foxholes, but they held that road open because there was no other choice, right? And eventually the other Marine forces egressed through that pass, got back to the junction, and got out of there. That's a really horrible thing to order those Marines to do and endure those conditions. But they did it because there was a much greater military necessity that required it. So there can be cold military calculations that require you to put your troops through really bad things, because there is a purpose for the suffering that they endure. But then this brings me to sort of my last point here, which is in implying that there is no longer any military value in Bakhmut. To me, there's also sort of this unspoken thing that says, kind of getting to like the sunk cost fallacy, right? Where like you've dumped so many resources into a thing, you want to see it succeed because you've dumped so many resources into the thing, right? And if you fail at the thing, then what were all those resources for? And I think sort of the implication is that this is where emotion maybe takes the place of logic in making decision making. And you don't want to make, destructive emotional decisions, right? You want to make logical decisions that support your thing. But I think that, we here who are not on that battlefield, we cannot fully appreciate the calculus of why you may tell your people to hold there and not fall back, even though, like, from a strictly military sense, you may want to, because there are other, I think, I don't want to call them emotional, but there are other political, humanitarian things that are at work here, which maybe we simply don't understand it because it's not our country, and we are not facing an existential crisis. So, talking about, say you fall back to, near Kramatorsk and the other ridge line, you lose that city. Okay, maybe you can hold that line that you fall back on, but now you're potentially exposing new cities at a minimum to more Russian long-range fires, right? How many more cities of yours are you willing to let turn into rubble? That's not a calculus I don't think we can understand. There's also the knowledge that everywhere Russian ground forces have gone, they have murdered, raped, tortured the people that were there, kidnapped children from their parents to take them back to Russia to reculturize and turn into Russians. They have done things to erase the Ukrainian identity that was in those cities, from issuing Russian passports to changing, Russian content in the school curricula, right? Like, trying to erase what used to be Ukraine when they take these cities. And then when the ground forces can't go in, right, they still try and kill and destroy from the air. So we watched all winter as they tried to destroy all the power infrastructure in Ukraine to freeze civilians to death. They freely bombed hospitals, schools, playgrounds, homes, apartment buildings. And then I noted, I don't think we talked about it, but I sent you the news headline. Today is a year ago when Russia bombed the Mariupol drama theater, that was full of hundreds of civilians, including large numbers of children. So all of that is what Russia does when its ground forces can't get close. And then they do all those other things when the ground forces do get in there. So I think the calculus that we don't fully understand and appreciate, because it is not a fight for survival for us, but it is for them, is that, like, how do you consciously decide to let them into a new place to do all those things if you have any capacity whatsoever to avoid that? And I ask myself, like, if those were our towns, our cities, right? Like, say there's like some brutal force that's up there in the northern part of Washington, D.C., right? And we had a thin line between that and everybody behind us. Like, would we give up? Would we fall back if we had any capacity to continue resisting? And so I think like the military calculus may not be the primary one at play here on the Ukrainian side, because their calculus is existential, right? We're looking at it because we have no skin in the game, so we can sort of armchair quarterback some of this stuff. But they have all the skin in the game, right? And that gives you a different balance of what factors are the most important. I'll wrap up here, but saying like 2 days ago, United States, we lost a drone and we got mad because the Russians were being unprofessional and unsafe, and we had to talk about how much better at aviation safety we are than the Russians are, right? A year ago, Ukraine had a theater full of children that was turned into rubble and body parts. We are operating under very different calculuses, very different perceptions of risk. And so when we say, like, why haven't they withdrawn yet? Why are they continuing to reinforce? There are some military reasons why you would do that, but I think there are other things at play that we cannot begin to weigh in the way that I'm sure they are weighing that, sort of in the scales of what they need to do.
And that's, putting it all together, the commander of the Ukrainian forces, General Zaluzhny, has made comments to the effect of, Bakhmut is important for strategic stability of the entire defensive front line. But he's also said, I can only ask for forgiveness from, the soldiers in the trenches. And part of, the description that you had of the Choisin Reservoir is that the ones in Bakhmut know nothing good is coming out of it. But to the extent that it basically helps maintain not just the humanitarian defense of that region, but also the political trajectories here. And this is something, that I want to just pull the thread of what you were just describing is if the Ukrainians start to give up one town, what would make them not give up the next one and the next one? Under the, sort of military expediency or sort of like this makes more military logic, ultimately they are trying to resist an invasion. And the key thing of what they want to basically, buck up their own morale, like within Ukraine itself, and also show to the Russians that they're not capitulating, but also show to like the broader West that is supporting them that they're worth supporting. And so in that regard, we have, whether it's any sunk cost fallacy, that could be one interpretation, and, that this is not like the best use of military resources, but in terms of having a larger theory of victory, the Ukrainian side is saying we will and are able and will continue to defend every part of our country. Therefore, we're not going to give in to the other side, and therefore we're worthy of continued support. That's ultimately, part of the thing here is that the Ukrainians need to be able to say why continued support makes more sense than withdrawing that support and bringing the war to, a conclusion that is much more favorable to Russia than to Ukraine. And in that regard, from the Russian side as well, they need victory just as much. And even though Putin has shown no regard for human life and has clearly not punished anyone for, bombing theaters full of children because, they're all, Nazi resistors in any case, using the Russian, propaganda narratives, is that even inside Russia, the public opinion polling in recent weeks has become quite clear that while overt support for the special military operation is quite high, the notion of economic anxiety is also rising quite a bit. And so, in this regard, the Russian side needs victory and preferably easy victory just as much in order to then basically have their side of the conversation be just as effective to their population, to the Ukrainian side, and to the broader West as well. So it's unfortunate that there basically was a town called Bakhmut. Not clear what's going to be Bakhmut after all this is done, but basically the trajectory of the rest of the war comes down to basically who wins in these sorts of high casualty, but basically low strategic importance types of contact.
Denying your opponent something that they really want, like that's have military value too, right? So, again, maybe the town itself on the map and the terrain, has not the value, but other things besides like sort of the numbers or the physical, the material aspect of it may matter, right, and may become militarily significant. So I'm thinking, like, I was thinking through it, depending how you want to characterize it, right, like, whether you're looking at Clausewitz's Trinity, where he talks about passion as an element of warfare, or if you go to my personal favorite, that John Boyd, where he says, like, it's machines don't fight wars, people fight wars, and they use their minds. But however you phrase it, the point is war is a human endeavor. It's not like a number crunching game. And so I feel like, in looking at should they pull back because of whether it's the material terrain or the number of, troops or, machines or bullets, whatever they're expending, right? It's not a numbers game. That's not the most important thing. It's the most important thing is what the humans engaged in it think is the most important thing. And if both sides think that the humans on both sides place value on something, it becomes valuable, whether or not, like, the material aspect of it seems less valuable. So I think that's been probably under considered here. And I'll make one last thing is in talking about the conditions of the soldiers, right? Materially, they are quite miserable. And they, in some places saying they don't have enough ammunition, and they would like more, and they're, living in these horrible conditions. But another note from those news stories was the overall morale of the forces remains strong. That is not insignificant. People can do pretty amazing things as long as their morale, their will. We talk about war as a clash of wills. As long as if will remains strong and they have any means of resisting, people will do incredible things and suffer incredible things materially, if mentally, spiritually, they feel like it's worth it. So I don't think that has not been necessarily counted enough. And the morale, the moral value, I say moral, not like right or wrong, but the intangible value for both sides may be militarily much more important than any whatever's left of that city, which is probably not going to be much. Which does intrinsically, inherently make it a militarily significant battle, right? Whether or not the material part of it seems like it makes sense to us.
Right. And it's in terms of, the morale, like having the continued will to resist. It's again on the Russian side, there are basically seemingly multiple videos per day of, like, new units basically making personal appeals to Putin to get them out of there or to give them the stuff that they need. And, in recent days, there has been a noticeable uptick in rumors about the next mobilization on the Russian side. That this would be another one of, 3, 4, 500,000 citizens to be mobilized for this. What's different about these rumors, and this really goes into the morale issue, is that this, wave of rumors regarding mobilization is basically to create, in as short a time period as it can possibly be, a new force to replace those soldiers who are not just being lost in Bakhmut, but that the Russian military anticipates will be lost in Ukraine's counteroffensive. And so, to this point, there's a lot of Wagner people, there's a lot of, like, mobilized people who get to the front, realize that basically this is a casualty intensive way of war that their side is pursuing, and don't want to be there either. So to the extent that they can at least say, you know what, we went to Bakhmut, we lost a lot of men, but eventually we took it. That will also have a positive effect on morale on the Russian side. And so, when we can think about the Ukrainians, it's not just about continuing their own will to resist, continuing their own high levels of morale of defending their country, defending their fellow citizens from, just brutal treatment, but also ensuring that the mobilized people, the Wagner people on the other side, don't think that this is going well. And that if they're going to be there, that they're going to also suffer as well. And that's just, the brutality that all gets put together.
Yeah, and it's again, looking away from the material, like is Bakhmut a material center of gravity for Ukraine or Russia, right? Maybe, maybe not. But what you just described is, and something that, in looking at the more intangible aspects of warfare, again, something that Boyd described was that, there's nobody has one center of gravity. You have multiple centers of gravity. Every single Russian person and their brain looking at this is a potential center of gravity, either for the good, right? If they take the town, those little centers of gravity become just a little bit stronger and more willing to continue. They do not. Each of those little centers of gravity becomes weaker. And then your overall situation becomes weaker, because all those little centers of gravity, those Russian mines that you're counting on in your bid for victory, they're not all on board, right? They're not going to be willing to fight as well, or as willing to be found on the streets and handed their draft notice, because defeat or failure on the battlefield has infected the minds of all those little centers of gravity. And again, that is of military value as well. You can't quantify it quite as much as numbers of troops lost, armored vehicles lost, bullets and artillery shells expended, but that has an impact. And so probably that's why I've been going on about this for a little while here, is the numbers are probably the least important thing here for both sides. The intangibles are really what this fight is all about around that city.
When we think about Bakhmut, it's the things that the battlefield represents rather than the battlefield itself that determine the importance of this particular town, and the reason the fighting for it will continue for quite a long while to come.
Yeah, and we'll see, right, depending on how how and where the Ukrainian counteroffensive goes and how well it lands. 3-4 months, we may not be talking about Bakhmut anymore, because it's not where the action has gone. But I think the ultimate point in this is we on the outsides, I really think we should reserve judgment on the quote unquote military value, because military value can be layered on by intangible things that may be of significant importance to the belligerents involved. And again, we don't have the skin in the game. Ukrainians have all the skin in the game. And at this point, Russia has expended a lot of skin, for very minimal gains. And they need to see something out of that. Or arguably that, Bakhmut might be more of a sunk cost fallacy for Russia at this point than Ukraine. But I just think we're not looking at it through the same lens as Russia and Ukraine are right now. And we should take pause and think about that before, sort of determine whether or not it's of military value, because military value is what the people fighting give it, not necessarily where it is on a map.
It's perhaps a good place to pause for that.
I guess on that note, all comes back to the intangibles, right? Napoleon said, right, the physical to spiritual is 1 to 4, 4 to 1, or whatever the ratio is. That hasn't changed. All right, well, great. I'm glad we exercised some discipline on ourselves and sticking to this. Probably, we'll be watching and see when the next time we want to do recording is here. But Yuval, again, thank you very much for your time. Definitely, in giving more time to this within 48 hours of the last one. So go have a happy birthday. Always great to have you on here, share insights, and to our audience, thank you for listening. And we will see you here again for the next one soon. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.